The year is AD 732, and the chill of autumn wraps around the plains of Tours, in the heart of what is now France. Dawn crawls across the horizon, slow, uncertain, as if the sun itself hesitates to rise on the day when Europe's fate will hang by a thread. Mist clings low to the earth. 1,000 breaths cloud the air, horses snorting, men murmuring prayers, armor creaking under the first light. The ground trembles faintly under the movement of tens of thousands of soldiers, waiting. Somewhere among them stands Charles Martel, the Frankish commander whose name, the Hammer, has already begun to echo in whispered tones across campfires. Ahead of him, a dark mass gathers, the Umayyad cavalry, veterans of 100 campaigns, banners fluttering like tongues of flame in the wind. Between them stretches the battlefield, rolling terrain littered with frost and the ghosts of morning fog. No one yet knows that within hours the outcome here will shape the destiny of an entire continent. Will the tide of Islamic expansion, unstoppable for a century, surge across the Pyrenees into the heart of Christian Europe? Or will the Franks, an emerging power forged from the ruins of Rome, stand firm enough to halt it? A young Frankish soldier grips his spear tighter, muttering a prayer he barely remembers. On the opposite side, an Arab horseman adjusts his curved sword, confident that victory and divine favor are already assured. Neither can imagine that by nightfall, one side will be broken, the other reborn as the savior of Europe's fragile order. Smoke from distant fires drifts through the cold air. The faint clang of metal carries on the wind. The stage is set for the Battle of Tours, where faith, ambition, and history itself will collide in one of the most decisive confrontations the world has ever seen. But before the first horn sounds and swords clash, one must understand the forces that brought these armies to this frozen dawn. The centuries of conquest, collapse, and ambition that shaped both sides, and the men whose decisions would set the course of Europe's future. To understand the thunder that rolled across the fields near Tours in 732, we must first trace the lightning that preceded it, centuries of conquests, collapses, and transformations that reshaped the face of the Mediterranean world. It begins 100 years earlier, in the deserts of Arabia. From the oases and trade routes of the Hijaz, the Islamic Caliphate had risen with astonishing speed. Within a single lifetime after the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632, Muslim armies had swept across Syria, Persia, Egypt, and North Africa. Their advance was not merely military, it carried with it a new political order, a spiritual unity that bound tribes and cities under the banner of Islam. By the early 8th century, the Umayyad Caliphate, ruling from Damascus, had become the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from the Indus River to the Atlantic Ocean. Yet empires by their nature hunger for more. The governors of Al-Andalus, Muslim-ruled Iberia, looked north toward the rich plains of Gaul, where fragmented kingdoms still struggled to define their borders after the fall of Rome. In 711, under the command of Tariq ibn Ziyad, the Muslim armies crossed the narrow strait that would forever bear his name, the Gibraltar, Jabal Tariq. The Visigothic kingdom of Hispania collapsed with shocking speed. Within a few years, the Umayyad banners flew from Toledo to the Pyrenees, and the Iberian Peninsula was theirs. But the warriors of Islam did not stop at the mountains. They looked beyond, toward the fertile lands of Aquitaine, the valley of the Loire, and the wealthy cities of the Frankish realm. To the Umayyad commanders, Gaul was a promise of gold, glory, and divine favor. To the Franks, it was the last wall standing before the heart of Christendom. At this moment in history, Western Europe was fragile, fractured by tribal politics, weakened by decades of warfare. The memory of the Roman Empire still haunted its ruins, but no empire had yet risen to take its place. The Merovingian kings of the Franks were little more than figureheads, and real power had shifted to their chief administrators, the mayors of the palace. Among them was Charles Martel, a man whose name would one day resonate as the savior of Europe. Charles was not born to secure power easily. His rise was forged through rebellion, civil war, and an unyielding will. When his father, Pepin of Herstal, died, Charles was imprisoned by political rivals. Yet he escaped, rallied loyal nobles, and through a decade of brutal campaigns, restored unity to the Frankish lands. His nickname, Martel, the Hammer, was not given for kindness. He wielded strength like a weapon of divine purpose, smashing his enemies into reluctant obedience. Meanwhile, in the south, Duke Odo of Aquitaine, a semi-independent Frankish noble, found himself at the front line of the Muslim advance. In 721, he achieved a stunning victory at Toulouse, defeating an Umayyad force led by Al-Sam ibn Malik al-Khawlani, the governor of Al-Andalus. The battle bought Gaul a brief reprieve, but the tide would return stronger. In 732, the new governor of Al-Andalus, Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, launched a massive invasion northward. His forces swept across the Pyrenees, captured Bordeaux, and crushed Duke Odo's army on the banks of the Garonne River. Contemporary chroniclers claimed the slaughter was so immense that God alone knew the number of the dead. Odo fled north, desperate and broken, seeking help from the one man who could muster an army capable of stopping the invaders, Charles Martel. Yet Odo was no friend of the Frankish ruler. Their rivalry had been fierce for years. Still, necessity forces strange alliances. Odo knelt before Martel, pledging allegiance in exchange for aid. Charles accepted, but his terms were harsh. From that moment, Aquitaine was bound to the Frankish crown. The stakes had never been higher. If the Umayyad army broke through, there would be nothing to stop them from advancing into the heart of Gaul, perhaps even beyond, to the Rhine, to the Alps, to Rome itself. Chroniclers like Isidore of Beja and later Paul the Deacon would claim that all of Christendom trembled at the thought. Imagine the contrast. On one side, the battle-hardened cavalry of the Umayyads, swift, disciplined, accustomed to desert warfare and the spoils of victory. On the other, the infantry-heavy Franks, armored, stoic, their shield walls as unyielding as their faith. It was more than a clash of armies. It was a collision of civilizations, of belief systems, of two visions of the world. As Abd al-Rahman's columns marched north through the Loire Valley, they looted and burned. Smoke rose from monasteries and villages, a black line marking their path. Word spread quickly. The Saracens are coming. Refugees fled toward the forests and mountains, whispering prayers as bells tolled warnings across the countryside. Somewhere along the route, Charles Martel's scouts watched from the shadows, measuring the enemy's strength. Reports reached Martel's war council. The invaders numbered perhaps 20,000 to 25,000, though some chroniclers exaggerated them to 50,000 or more. The Franks, mustering every levy and veteran they could, may have numbered between 15,000 and 30,000. But Charles had one crucial advantage: the terrain and the element of patience. In the weeks before the battle, as both armies maneuvered across the Loire, the stage was set for a confrontation that neither could avoid. The Umayyads, burdened by plunder and emboldened by victory, sought one more decisive strike to break Frankish resistance. The Franks, knowing they faced annihilation if they failed, gathered in silence, choosing ground that would favor defense over speed. The men on both sides could feel the tension pressing down like the coming frost of autumn. Every scout's report, every column of enemy troops glimpsed in the distance, brought the reality of the imminent clash into sharp focus. Soon, the fields around Tours would become a crucible where strategy, courage, and faith would be tested, and where the destiny of Europe itself would hang in the balance. Autumn, 732. The land around Tours shimmered in muted tones of brown and gold. The leaves were dying, and so soon would men. Charles Martel's army gathered slowly and deliberately, like a storm condensing on the horizon. He refused to rush, knowing that his greatest weapon was not his sword, but time. Every hour bought meant fewer supplies for the invaders, colder nights for their horses, and lower morale for soldiers far from home. The Franks, farmers, freemen, and veteran warriors alike, marched north in small groups, converging on the plateau between the Vienne and Loire rivers. Charles chose his battlefield with a strategist's precision. It was high ground, broken by woods and gentle ridges, terrain that nullified the enemy's greatest strength, their cavalry. The Umayyad horsemen needed open plains to maneuver, to unleash the devastating charges that had shattered so many foes from Persia to Iberia. Here, among the rolling hills and tangled thickets of central Gaul, their mobility would be trapped. For days, the Franks built their formation not with walls or fortresses, but with discipline. They formed tight ranks, lines of shielded infantry standing shoulder to shoulder, spears angled forward like a forest of steel. Their armor was heavy, their footing firm, their faith ironclad. They did not come for glory. They came to survive. Martel's war council was brief and direct. There were no elaborate speeches, no grand promises of victory. He reminded his men of what was at stake, not just their homes, but their very way of life. Behind us, he said, are our wives, our children, our churches. There is nowhere to retreat. We stand or we vanish. In the Umayyad camp, Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi prepared with equal determination. He was no reckless marauder, but a seasoned commander, once a governor of Al-Andalus, a veteran of campaigns across Iberia and the Maghreb. He had crushed Odo at Bordeaux and burned through Aquitaine with surgical precision. His troops, Arab and Berber, were fierce, loyal, and confident. Many believed they were instruments of divine will, continuing the expansion of Islam that had triumphed everywhere it marched. Yet even in victory, there were murmurs. The long campaign north had stretched supply lines thin. The spoils of conquest slowed the army's movement. Some soldiers were weary from constant fighting, others distracted by plunder. And though Abd al-Rahman was respected, the mix of ethnic groups within his army, Arab nobles, Berber warriors, local converts, made unity a fragile thing. On the eve of battle, two worlds prepared in silence. In the Frankish camp, fires burned low. Men sat in small circles sharpening blades, whispering prayers in Latin and Old Frankish. The smell of boiled grain and smoke hung heavy in the cold air. Some prayed to the Christian God for deliverance, others simply to see another dawn. Scouts returned with reports of the enemy, columns of horsemen, standards glittering, their tents spreading like dark sails over the valley below. Martel moved among his soldiers, saying little. His presence alone steadied them. Chroniclers later wrote that he was calm as iron, his face shadowed by the cross of his helmet. His commanders, grim-faced men like Audo Eudes and Hildebrand, stood ready at his side. Behind them, the banner of the Franks, plain, unadorned, flapped in the autumn wind. Across the valley, Abd al-Rahman's camp was alive with the sound of preparation. Horses were brushed and saddled, armor polished, curved sabers gleaming in the lamplight. The smell of roasted meat and incense drifted through the rows of tents. The muezzin's call echoed faintly over the plain, a haunting sound that reached even the Frankish lines. For the soldiers of Islam, this was not merely conquest, it was jihad, a struggle sanctified by faith. Yet Abd al-Rahman hesitated to attack. He had underestimated the Franks' position, and his scouts warned that the enemy stood firm on defensive ground. The caliph's governor preferred mobility, speed, and open battle, but here, Martel forced him into unfamiliar terrain. So for nearly a week, the two armies stared at one another across the misty fields, neither willing to make the first move. Each morning, frost covered the ground. Each night, campfires dotted the darkness like constellations on earth. Tension built like a storm cloud, ready to burst. When small skirmishes broke out between scouting parties, the shouts and clash of steel echoed through the valleys, only to fade into silence again. The men on both sides could sense it. The longer this stalemate lasted, the more dangerous it became. Rumors spread. Some Frankish soldiers claimed they had seen angels hovering over Martel's army. Others swore that they heard the wailing of spirits from the forests. In the Muslim camp, whispers circulated that the Franks had invoked ancient gods for protection, their hilltop position cursed by old pagan magic. It was superstition born from fear, but fear was a weapon, and Martel wielded it well. His men grew accustomed to their position, digging in, strengthening their line. They learned to stand still under taunts and provocations. When Umayyad riders galloped near the Frankish line, waving banners and shouting insults, the Franks did not move. They waited, silent and immovable like statues of iron. Abd al-Rahman grew impatient. His army, restless and cold, pressed for battle. His lieutenants urged him to attack before supplies ran low and the season turned harsher. And so, on the 7th day, when the morning mist rose to reveal a pale sun, he made his decision. The Umayyad banners lifted in unison. Trumpets blared across the field. The horsemen began to move, first at a trot, then at a gallop. In the Frankish line, shields tightened. Spears angled forward. Charles Martel raised his sword high, the steel catching the first light of dawn. The ground itself seemed to hold its breath. Every heart, Frankish and Umayyad alike, beat faster. Months of maneuvering, skirmishes, and strategic patience had led to this moment. The calm before the storm stretched across the valley, taut as a bowstring, ready to release a thunder no one could withstand. And then, the silence shattered. The clash was about to begin. The morning mist had barely lifted when the first wave of sound tore across the valley, a deep, rolling thunder of hooves. The Umayyad cavalry, hundreds wide and thousands deep, came on like a tide of living iron. Spears angled forward, banners whipping, the sunlight flashing on curved swords. The ground shook beneath their charge. At the crest of the ridge, Charles Martel's army stood motionless. Rows of Frankish infantry, broad-shouldered, armored, shields interlocked, waited in grim silence. They had no war drums, no horns, no chants, only the steady rhythm of breath and heartbeat. Their eyes watched the horizon darken with the oncoming storm. The first impact was terrifying. The Umayyad cavalry crashed into the Frankish line with the force of a hammer blow. Horses screamed, metal rang, and the earth beneath them seemed to split. The Arab and Berber riders expected the Franks to crumble, as so many enemies had before. But the shield wall did not break. Martel's men stood shoulder to shoulder, their shields locked, their spears thrusting up in deadly rhythm. When a rider fell, his horse stumbled into the next, breaking the momentum of the charge. The slope favored the defenders. The ground beneath the hooves was soft and uneven, robbing the cavalry of its speed. Within moments, the thunder became chaos. The battle raged from morning to dusk, a grinding clash of armor and flesh. The Franks fought in silence, each man trusting the wall beside him, each knowing that if one faltered, all would die. The Umayyads fought with fury, shouting the takbir, Allahu Akbar, as they plunged again and again into the line. Abd al-Rahman rode among his men, urging them forward. His presence, calm and commanding, steadied the wavering ranks. But Charles Martel, watching from a low rise, saw what few commanders dared to see, that patience could kill faster than aggression. He refused to counterattack. He knew his infantry could not chase horsemen across open ground. Their power lay in endurance, and so the Franks absorbed each charge like a stone wall against waves. The battle turned into a brutal test of attrition. The midday sun hung pale behind drifting clouds of dust. The field became a slaughterhouse, bodies of men and horses tangled together, weapons slick with blood. The air was thick with screams and the smell of iron. Still, neither side broke. As the day wore on, the Umayyads began to falter. Their cavalry had failed to pierce the Frankish line, and the discipline of the Franks, unmoving, unyielding, was breaking their spirit. Abd al-Rahman ordered new attacks, sending squadrons to probe the flanks, hoping to find weakness. But the terrain worked against him. The wooded ridges and narrow approaches gave no room for sweeping maneuvers. Then came the turning point. Late in the afternoon, as shadows lengthened, word spread through the Umayyad ranks that their camp was under attack. A detachment of Franks, or perhaps Aquitanian scouts loyal to Duke Odo, had slipped behind the enemy line, striking at the baggage train where the spoils of months of conquest were stored: gold, silks, captives, and treasure. The rumor spread like wildfire. Some Umayyad soldiers broke formation, galloping back toward camp to protect their plunder. The cohesion of the army, already strained by exhaustion, began to fracture. Abd al-Rahman tried to rally them riding along the line, shouting orders. But confusion reigned. Charles Martel saw his moment. He ordered his reserves forward, the seasoned warriors he had held back since dawn. They surged into the gap left by the retreating cavalry, driving wedges into the enemy's formation. The shield wall advanced step by step, pressing the Umayyads downhill. In the chaos, Abd al-Rahman was struck down. Accounts differ. Some say he was surrounded by Frankish spearmen, others that he fell to an arrow while trying to rally his men. But when his banner dropped, the Umayyad line dissolved. Night descended on a field of broken steel and dying men. The Franks, exhausted and bloodied, held their ground under the cold stars. Martel forbade pursuit. He feared an ambush in the dark. His soldiers collapsed where they stood, too weary to celebrate. The cries of the wounded echoed through the night like lamentations of ghosts. At dawn, silence. The Frankish scouts moved cautiously across the field. They found the Umayyad camp abandoned. The survivors had fled south in the night, carrying their fallen leader with them. The road back to Iberia was littered with discarded weapons and burnt wagons. The Battle of Tours, or Poitiers, as some chroniclers later called it, was over. The ground was strewn with the bodies of thousands. Contemporary sources disagree on numbers. The Mozarabic Chronicle claims the Franks slew 375,000, an obvious exaggeration, while modern estimates suggest perhaps 10,000 Umayyad dead to around 1,000 Frankish casualties. Whatever the count, the victory was total. The shock of it rippled across the world. For the first time, the expansion of the Islamic Caliphate, which had surged across 3 continents, had been stopped, not by desert or sea, but by men who refused to yield an inch. When word reached Damascus, the Caliph reportedly mourned his fallen general but did not send another great army north. The tide had met the wall and broken. When the sun rose fully over the field of Tours, it revealed a landscape unrecognizable from the day before. The valley that had once echoed with the thunder of cavalry was now a graveyard. Smoke drifted low, carrying with it the stench of iron and decay. Armor glinted faintly among the corpses. Horses lay where they had fallen, their bodies twisted in agony, their riders still clutching reins that led nowhere. For 2 full days, Charles Martel allowed his army to remain on the field, wary of a possible counterattack. Scouts combed the forests and ravines, but no enemy force returned. The Umayyad survivors, leaderless and shaken, had retreated in disorder, fleeing back across the Pyrenees to the safety of Al-Andalus. The invincible tide had receded. The Frankish soldiers moved among the dead in silence, burying their own and stripping weapons from their foes. There was no triumph in their faces, only exhaustion and disbelief. They had survived what many believed to be the end of Christendom, and yet the cost was etched into every gaze. Chroniclers later wrote that the battlefield remained silent for 7 days, broken only by the cawing of crows and the tolling of church bells from distant Tours. The monks of the nearby abbey ventured out to tend to the wounded, whispering prayers over the fallen, regardless of their faith. Even the victors seemed haunted by the scale of what they had done. Duke Odo of Aquitaine, whose earlier defeat had drawn this cataclysm northward, returned to the field to honor Martel. Their uneasy alliance, born of necessity, had saved Gaul, but Odo's pride burned quietly beneath his gratitude. He knew now that Aquitaine's independence was gone. The Frankish crown would never again release its grip. In the Umayyad camp, abandoned wagons and empty tents told their own story. The plundered treasures of Aquitaine, gold, silk, and captives, lay scattered and trampled. Among them were shattered Korans, broken standards, and weapons bent by impact. It was as if the wind itself refused to carry the memory of this defeat. Charles Martel, pragmatic as always, refused to glorify the battle as divine deliverance. He ordered his chroniclers to record it plainly. The men of the north stood firm, and the men of the south withdrew. To him, this was not yet victory. It was survival, but word spread swiftly, and legend outran truth. Across monasteries from Rome to the Rhine, messengers brought the news. The Saracens had been broken, and Europe was safe. Church bells rang, and prayers of thanksgiving rose like a new dawn. In later centuries, the story would take on mythic proportions. Charles, the Hammer of God, standing alone against the armies of Islam. But in the moment, he remained cautious, ever the soldier, ever aware that victory today did not guarantee peace tomorrow. In the days that followed, he ordered patrols southward to shadow the retreating Umayyads, ensuring they did not regroup. Scouts reported trails of dead horses, discarded armor, and wounded stragglers limping home. Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi's body, according to some accounts, was buried secretly by his men before their flight. Others said it was left behind, unmarked, lost among thousands. For the people of Gaul, the aftermath was surreal. Villages burned in the earlier invasion stood silent now, their inhabitants either slain or hiding in the forests. When they emerged, they found a world transformed. The invaders were gone, but the scars remained: smoke-blackened walls, charred fields, ruined churches. Yet from the ashes rose something new, a fragile but burning hope that the tide could, in fact, be turned. In Tours, the bishop led processions through the streets, carrying relics and chanting hymns. The city had been spared by a battle fought miles away, but every citizen knew how close death had come. Among Martel's men, there was no treasure to divide, no grand spoils to parade. Their reward was simpler: the knowledge that they had stood and lived. When the army finally began to disband, they marched home in silence, their armor dented, their banners torn. They returned to farms and villages that would sing their names for generations. For Charles Martel himself, the victory solidified a power he had long fought to claim. The Frankish nobles who had once doubted him now called him Defender of the Faith, a title whispered from cloisters to royal courts. His authority stretched further than ever before, binding the disparate tribes of the Franks into something resembling unity. Yet he did not celebrate. The chronicles record no feasts, no proclamations of glory. He was too shrewd to believe the danger had passed forever. A storm that has broken once, he is said to have remarked, can gather again. The fields of Tours fell silent once more, reclaimed by wind and rain. The bodies were buried, the weapons rusted, and the grass grew thick over the graves. But beneath that soil, history had turned. The morning fog had barely lifted when the sound began, a low, steady thunder that seemed to rise from the soil itself. It was the drumming of hooves. The Umayyad cavalry, glittering under the pale sun, began to move. From the Frankish lines, it looked like the sea was advancing. Thousands of riders in dark armor, banners snapping, voices lifted in cries of Allahu Akbar, the invocation that had carried them from the sands of Arabia to the mountains of Gaul. Charles Martel watched in silence. Around him, the Franks held their formation, thick ranks of infantry locked in a defensive square, shields overlapping, spears angled outward like the spines of a giant iron beast. They had no cavalry worth speaking of. Their strength was endurance, not speed. They waited for the impact. The first charge hit like a storm. The Umayyads crashed into the Frankish wall, lances snapping, swords hacking. The noise was unbearable, a blend of screams, metal, and thunder. Horses reared and fell, crushed underfoot. Men vanished in the crush, the ground slick with blood and mud. But the line held. For every Frank who fell, another stepped forward to close the gap. Martel had chosen his ground wisely. The slopes and forested edges of the battlefield blunted the full force of the Umayyad cavalry. They couldn't maneuver freely, couldn't circle around as they had done in so many other victories. The Franks fought shoulder to shoulder, immovable, grim, and unyielding. As the hours dragged on, Abd al-Rahman's frustration grew. He was a veteran commander, accustomed to breaking foes quickly and chasing them down in glorious pursuit. But here the enemy refused to run. They stood like stone, and his cavalry, his greatest weapon, was bleeding itself dry against an unbreakable wall. Charles saw the moment of hesitation and acted. With a signal, he sent his reserve troops sweeping around to strike the Umayyad flank. small, disciplined bands that attacked supply wagons and camp followers. A ripple of chaos ran through the Muslim army. Rumors spread that their general was under attack, their camp overrun. In that confusion, the tide turned. Abd al-Rahman rode forward to rally his men, but amid the crush and confusion, he was struck down, his life ending in the chaos of dust and steel. When word reached the front lines, panic followed. The unified rhythm of the Umayyad assault broke apart, turning into scattered skirmishes, desperate retreats, and the long echo of defeat. Night fell over a field littered with bodies. The moans of the dying carried through the cold air. The Franks, exhausted, held their ground until dawn, uncertain if the enemy would return. But when the sun rose, the plains of Tours were silent. The Umayyad army was gone, retreated beyond the Pyrenees, and Europe, for the moment, had been saved. When the survivors counted the fallen, neither side could claim a clean victory. But history would remember only one truth. The advance of Islam into Western Europe had been stopped. Charles Martel became a legend, his name echoing through monasteries, halls, and chronicles. The man who had stood firm when all seemed lost would be remembered as Charles the Hammer, the savior of Christendom, the defender of the West. Yet the truth, as always, was more complex. Martel hadn't fought for faith alone. He fought for power, for the unity of the Frankish realm, for the fragile order that might one day give rise to something greater, something we now call Europe. His victory at Tours didn't end the Umayyad Empire, but it defined a border between two worlds, a line that would hold for centuries. The Umayyads retreated, consolidating in Al-Andalus. From there, their culture would flourish in Spain, bringing science, art, philosophy, and architecture that would later inspire the very Europe they once sought to conquer. The clash of Tours didn't extinguish the flame of Islam. It forced it to burn differently, shaping the medieval world in subtle, profound ways. For Charles Martel, the triumph was both a beginning and a legacy. His descendants would build upon it, most famously his grandson, Charlemagne, who would forge the Holy Roman Empire and carry forward the idea of a united Christian Europe. The hammer had struck once, and the echo would last for centuries. Historians still argue about the true significance of the Battle of Tours. Was it truly the moment that saved Europe, or simply one chapter in a much larger saga? Some point out that the Umayyads were already stretched thin, that their withdrawal was more logistical than catastrophic. Others insist that without Martel, Western Europe might have become part of the Islamic world, its art, politics, and faith forever altered. Whatever the truth, the symbolism remains powerful. Tours became the story of resistance, of standing one's ground when the odds seem impossible. It became a myth, yes, but also a mirror. Each generation sees in it what it needs most. To some, it's a triumph of faith. To others, a warning about cultural collision. And to a few, it's simply the reminder that history pivots not on destiny, but on the choices of flawed, determined humans. Charles Martel didn't know he was saving Europe. He just knew he couldn't afford to lose. And that perhaps is why he won.